All right, so today we're diving into Eritrea.
Okay.
I'm guessing most people listening probably couldn't place it on a map right away.
Yeah, probably not.
It's this small country in the Horn of Africa, but it's got this, tangled history with its neighbor, Ethiopia.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And one of the things we're looking at for this deep dive is this declassified CIA document from the 70s,
Wow.
analyzing whether Eritrea could actually survive on its own.
That's wild. They were already thinking about that back then, huh?
Yeah, and it really gets to the heart of the issue, doesn't it?
It does. We're going to try and unravel this whole puzzle together.
Yeah.
Looking at, the history, the economics.
Right.
Even a bit of potential oil drama along the way.
Ooh, exciting. Okay, so before we get to Eritrea itself,
Yeah.
we need to set the stage with Ethiopia.
Okay.
Think of it like this massive, diverse empire, 3 times the size of California,
Wow.
with this history full of emperors, invaders, and these constant power struggles.
Yeah, you can almost imagine it like a real-life Game of Thrones, right?
Oh, totally.
Like all these different factions fighting for control over this vast and really fractured land.
So while Ethiopia was going through all of this,
Yeah.
where was Eritrea?
Well, Eritrea was always on the fringes of this empire, never truly integrated. And that's a really key point, I think, to understand,
Okay.
because it kind of sets the stage for the conflict that eventually came up.
So tell me more about this different world.
Sure.
What was going on in Eritrea while Ethiopia was having its Game of Thrones moment?
Well, starting in the 1890s, Eritrea was under Italian rule,
Okay.
and that had a huge impact on its development.
Really? How so?
Well, the Italians, despite all their faults, they brought modernization to Eritrea. Roads, railways, industry, education, even a modern administration.
Things that Ethiopia didn't have.
Darkly lack, yeah.
So while Ethiopia was struggling to maintain its empire, Eritrea was getting a crash course in modernization from the Italians.
Right.
Did that create resentment between the two?
It definitely laid the groundwork for this sense of separateness. And then after World War II, the British took over for about a decade.
Right.
And they kind of further shaped Eritrea's identity.
Okay.
They encouraged, the formation of labor unions, political parties. They even established an elected legislature.
Wow.
So this fostered a sense of political awareness among Eritreans,
Yeah.
and importantly, a separate Eritrean identity distinct from Ethiopia.
So we've got this historical backdrop of separation and different developmental paths.
Exactly.
And then 1952 rolls around.
Right.
Based on this UN decision, Eritrea becomes part of Ethiopia.
Yeah,
But I'm sensing there's a but here.
you're right. The UN decision came with this huge caveat.
Okay.
Eritrea was promised a significant degree of autonomy.
Oh, so they weren't supposed to just become another province.
Exactly. They were supposed to have their own say in things.
This promise of autonomy seems crucial.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Did Ethiopia keep its word?
Sadly, no. They gradually chipped away at Eritrea's autonomy,
Oh, wow.
eventually just reducing it to another province in 1962.
So it wasn't just about land then?
No, it was about identity, about feeling suppressed.
Right.
Imagine having your voice taken away, your distinct culture minimized.
Yeah.
That's bound to create resentment.
Absolutely. So you have the simmering resentment from broken promises.
Right.
And then, as if that wasn't complex enough,
Yeah,
you mentioned that Eritrea itself wasn't this perfectly unified entity.
it wasn't.
So what were the internal divisions that made the situation even more complicated?
Well, firstly, you have this near-even split between Christians and Muslims, which inevitably brought its own tensions.
Right.
Then you have layered on top of that
Yeah.
social divisions based on language,
Okay.
ethnicity, and even lifestyle,
Like what?
like farmers versus nomads,
Huh.
city dwellers versus those in rural areas.
So it wasn't a homogenous society by any means.
Not at all.
Did these internal divisions play a role in how different groups felt about separating from Ethiopia?
Definitely. For example, the Muslim herdsmen in the lowlands,
Okay.
who were often marginalized.
Right.
They saw independence as a chance for self-determination.
That makes sense.
But the picture was far from simple.
Yeah.
Different groups had different priorities and concerns.
Okay, so we've got this history of broken promises, internal divisions, and this simmering resentment.
It's a lot.
What was the spark that finally pushed things over the edge?
Well, there were several events, but one pivotal one was the killing of General Amin in November 1974.
Okay.
Amin was a prominent Eritrean figure.
Right.
And his death, viewed by many as politically motivated,
Yeah.
really pushed even many Christian Eritreans
Okay.
who had previously been more open to some form of continued relationship with Ethiopia towards the idea of complete independence.
It's often these tragic events that become turning points in history.
It's true.
It's interesting how the impact of his death transcended the existing religious and social divides in Eritrea.
Yeah, it really brought people together in a way.
Was there anyone who didn't support separation from Ethiopia at this point?
Well, there was another group adding complexity to the situation.
Okay.
The Danakil tribesmen in southeastern Eritrea.
I don't know much about them.
They were these fiercely independent people used to living on their own terms.
Really?
They were essentially left alone by the Ethiopian government.
Huh. Why is that?
Due to their, let's say, strong aversion to outside authority
Oh.
and the challenging desert environment they inhabited.
So even if Eritrea achieved independence,
Yeah.
integrating the Danakil, who were used to their own autonomy,
Right.
would be another hurdle to overcome.
For sure.
It's almost like a separate conflict within the larger conflict.
It really is. It raises questions about how a newly independent Eritrea would handle such diverse
Yeah.
and sometimes conflicting internal groups,
Right.
while also trying to establish itself as a viable nation.
And that leads us to the million-dollar question.
The big one.
Could Eritrea actually survive on its own?
Yeah.
Or was it destined to be tied to Ethiopia?
Good question.
So we've set the scene, right? A history of simmering resentment and broken promises, internal divisions.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And now this question, could Eritrea actually make it on its own?
Right, and that's where this declassified CIA document comes in.
Okay.
It's from the 70s.
Wow.
It's like this time capsule giving us a glimpse into how they analyzed Eritrea's chances back then.
Fascinating. Let's crack it open. What did the CIA think? Was Eritrea destined to fail?
Well, it's a mixed bag.
Okay.
They acknowledged that Eritrea had some things going for it.
Like what?
They had some existing industries,
Okay.
an oil refinery at Asa, a cement plant at Massawa, and some smaller-scale manufacturing.
So not an industrial powerhouse, but at least it's something.
Yeah, exactly. Not starting from scratch.
Okay, so some industry. But Eritrea is a small country with limited resources. Were there any areas where they had a real advantage, something they could build on?
Interestingly enough, livestock was a bright spot.
Livestock.
Yeah, Eritrea had this strong tradition of livestock farming, and the CIA saw this as a potential source of economic strength.
Really?
Yeah, they could export meat, dairy products, leather goods.
It's funny to think that cows and goats could be a key to national survival.
Right. Well, every little bit helps.
True. What about those limited resources you mentioned? How dire was the situation?
Well, their agricultural potential was really restricted. Only about 3% of the land was suitable for cultivation.
3%? Wow.
Yeah, imagine trying to feed your family when only 3% of your backyard can grow food.
That's tough.
It meant they'd be heavily reliant on imports, even for staples like grain.
So food security would be a major concern right out of the gate. Not a great start.
Yeah, it's not exactly a recipe for a stable and prosperous nation.
What did the CIA think about their overall chances given these challenges?
The document stressed that Eritrea's viability as a separate state would depend on two crucial factors:
Okay.
foreign aid and investment,
Makes sense.
and maintaining enough political stability to actually attract and keep foreign businesses and skilled workers.
So basically they'd need outside help.
Yeah.
And a peaceful internal environment to even have a shot.
Exactly. It's a pretty precarious situation.
Kind of like walking a tightrope with no safety net. Did the CIA see any way they could improve their odds?
They did point out one potential game changer:
Okay, what's that?
the possibility of skilled Eritrean professionals returning home.
Oh, interesting.
Many of them had left for Addis Ababa,
Ethiopia's capital.
right, seeking better opportunities.
Yeah.
But if they decided to come back and bring their business and commercial expertise,
It could give the Eritrean economy a boost.
exactly, a much-needed boost.
Kind of like a reverse brain drain.
Right,
Makes sense. If you're trying to build a nation from scratch, you need all the talent you can get.
absolutely.
But of course, that assumes these professionals would be willing to leave the relative stability and opportunity of Addis Ababa
Yeah.
for a newly independent and very uncertain Eritrea.
For sure, it would be a gamble for them,
Big time,
but also a chance to be part of building something new.
right? And let's not forget Ethiopia's willingness to engage in trade and economic cooperation.
Oh yeah, that would be essential for Eritrea's success.
If they turn their back on Eritrea,
It would make things even tougher.
for sure. Okay, so that's Eritrea's side of the equation.
Right.
But what about Ethiopia?
Mm.
They were already one of the world's poorest nations facing a whole host of economic challenges.
Yeah, it's true.
How would losing Eritrea impact them?
Well, they already had a lack of modern skills and infrastructure,
Right.
few mineral resources,
Hmm.
a tiny manufacturing sector,
Okay.
and an agricultural system at the mercy of unpredictable weather and fluctuating global prices.
So losing Eritrea with its existing industries and potential
Right.
would just add to their burden.
It would.
So they were already struggling.
Yeah.
And this would make things even harder. Did the CIA think Ethiopia would be able to survive the loss of Eritrea?
They concluded that Ethiopia, despite all these hardships, would likely still be viable even without Eritrea.
Okay, so they'd survive, but it wouldn't be pretty.
Pretty much.
What about access to the sea?
Ah, yes.
Ethiopia's landlocked, right? So ports are crucial for them. Would losing Eritrea cut them off entirely?
You're hitting on a key strategic issue.
I try.
The ports of Massawa and Assab in Eritrea were Ethiopia's most direct routes for trade,
Okay.
especially for the northern and western parts of the country. Losing them would be a significant blow.
But didn't Ethiopia have another option? What about Djibouti? Weren't they already using that port?
You're right. At the time, Ethiopia's main port was actually Djibouti,
Okay.
which was then the French territory of Ophars and Isis.
Basically a French colony.
Yeah, on the Red Sea coast, it was handling the majority of Ethiopia's trade, but relying solely on Djibouti wouldn't be ideal.
Especially if they lost access to Eritrea's ports.
Exactly. It would put a huge strain on Djibouti's infrastructure
Right.
and wouldn't be as efficient for goods coming from or going to certain parts of Ethiopia.
So it'd add costs, delays, complexity. Okay, so even though they had a backup option, losing Massawa and Assab would still be a major disadvantage for Ethiopia.
Absolutely.
And there's another wrinkle to the port situation, right?
Oh, yeah.
The Eritrean rebels, even while fighting for independence, publicly stated that they were willing to negotiate a deal that would allow Ethiopia to continue using Massawa and Assab.
Interesting.
That seems surprisingly pragmatic for a group in the middle of a rebellion. Were they just trying to look good in the eyes of the world?
It's open to interpretation.
Okay.
Some might see it as a sign of pragmatism,
Right.
recognizing the economic benefits of cooperation.
Makes sense.
Others might view it as a sign of weakness, a way to appease Ethiopia and the international community.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole independence question.
It does.
Like, are they truly ready to go it alone?
Yeah.
Or are they hedging their bets?
Good question. And then there's the issue of the oil refinery at Assab.
Right.
Remember, that was Eritrea's only refinery,
Yeah.
and it was processing crude oil from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Losing it would be a major headache for Ethiopia.
So not only would they potentially lose their most convenient ports,
Yeah.
but they'd also lose their only source of refined oil within their borders. Talk about adding insult to injury.
Exactly. It would definitely add to their economic difficulties, as the CIA document put it.
It's interesting how they phrase that, add to its economic difficulties.
Yeah,
Almost like there might have been other economic problems brewing that the document doesn't spell out.
that's a good point. It makes you wonder what other factors might have been at play.
Right, like were there other economic vulnerabilities that Ethiopia was facing? Were there external pressures,
Yeah.
hidden agendas influencing the situation?
It's like a single sentence opens a window into a deeper, more complex story.
It's fascinating how a seemingly straightforward geopolitical situation
Right.
can have all these hidden complexities and layers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that even these like isolated conflicts
Yeah.
can be influenced by all sorts of external factors.
Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to what I think is one of the most crucial aspects of this whole story.
Okay,
The role of international players.
right.
The CIA document only briefly touches on this, but it's clear that external forces could have a huge impact on the situation.
Yeah, we've talked about the need for foreign aid and investment.
Right.
But there's also the question of political influence.
Oh, for sure.
Like who would side with Eritrea
Yeah.
and who would stick with Ethiopia.
Exactly. Back in the 1970s, you had the Cold War in full swing.
Right.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union were like vying for influence all over the world.
Yeah.
And a strategically located region like the Horn of Africa.
With its proximity to the Red Sea in the Middle East.
Exactly. Would have been prime real estate.
So you can imagine both superpowers trying to woo either Ethiopia or an independent Eritrea to their side.
Oh, totally.
Maybe offering economic assistance, military support, favorable trade deals.
Absolutely. And then you have other regional players like Saudi Arabia,
Right.
which was already supplying oil to the refinery in the Saab.
Yeah.
They would have their own interests to protect as well.
It's a good giant chess game with each player trying to make the best move for their own advantage.
It really is.
It suddenly feels like this small corner of Africa is at the center of a global tug of war. What a tangled web. So knowing all of this, what are the main takeaways for Eritrea and Ethiopia? What's the big picture for our listener who's been following this story with us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that Eritrea's chances of survival as an independent nation were uncertain,
Okay.
but not impossible. They had some potential strengths,
Yeah.
but they also faced some significant obstacles.
Right.
And for Ethiopia, losing Eritrea would be a blow,
Yeah.
but not necessarily a fatal one.
Okay.
It would make their already challenging path even tougher,
Right.
but they'd likely find a way to adapt.
It's a reminder that even when things seem bleak,
Yeah,
there's always a glimmer of hope, a chance for things to turn around.
that's true.
But it also highlights the complexities of these situations
Yeah.
and how outcomes are rarely clear-cut.
Exactly. And that brings me to a final thought I'd like to leave our listeners with.
Okay?
We've discussed the potential roles of the U.S. and the Soviet Union,
Right.
but what about China?
Ah, yes, China. They've been increasingly active in Africa in recent decades,
They have.
investing heavily in infrastructure and resources.
That's right.
Could they become a major player in this region, too?
That's the question I want our listeners to ponder.
Okay.
How might China's growing influence impact the balance of power in the Horn of Africa?
It's a good question.
Could they become a key partner for either Eritrea or Ethiopia, helping them navigate their challenges?
Yeah.
Or might their involvement create new tensions and complexities,
Right.
adding another layer to this already intricate situation?
It's amazing how this deep dive has taken us from a declassified CIA document to pondering the future of global power dynamics.
I know, it's pretty wild.
It just goes to show that even the seemingly obscure corners of our world can hold profound insights and implications for the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you learned something new and maybe even developed a newfound appreciation for the complexity of geopolitics. Until next time, keep diving deep.